Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and one of the best seasons of Power Rangers has to be Time Force. It's layered, nuanced, and carefully cultivated in ways that few other seasons can claim, and because of that, it can also claim to have some of the all-time best Power Rangers, but we'll get to them. So, where do we start? At the beginning, of course, which for this season means the year 3000. With all that said, it's finally time for Time Force. Time Force's opening two episodes, Force from the Future, are unique because this is usually where you split the character focus to better understand the team coming together, usually for the first time. But since this team has been a team for at least a while before the show officially starts, they don't really need to do that and instead opt to focus purely on Jen, Alex, and Rancic, and then Wes in part 2. The episode begins with Time Force almost finished with its job of capturing every criminal except for Rancic, and then Alex, the Red Ranger at the time, successfully captures him too. With the streets officially cleaned, it's as good a time as any to propose to Jen. But then, as we know, it doesn't take Rancic too long to not only escape, but to escape with a time manipulation device and an army of captured mutants. But before that, Alex allegedly dies by Rancic's hands. This is important, not just because he's Jen's fiancé, but also because Rancic escaping is partly on her to begin with. And now, with a heavy heart, the role of leader falls to Jen, as her team then uses a time ship to travel back to the year 2001. It bears noting right now that many of the story beats in this season do take inspiration from Lost Galaxy, namely, the idea of having to march forward in the wake of a loved one thought lost forever. Also, the fact that the man who supposedly died here is kind of rough around the edges while his replacement is more fun-loving and has to learn responsibility is about as close as it gets to the Mike Leo scenario of yesteryear. So much so that Alex is actually revealed to be a descendant of Wes, which is pretty impossible since their genetics are literally the same, i.e. Jason Font plays them both, but yeah, it gets a little crazy with time travel, so we'll save all that stuff for later. While Quasar Quest was the better opening episode, Force from the Future did a ton right here as well. First of all, portraying Rancic as literally the last villain that Time Force considers a major threat adds to his character without Rancic having to actually tell us how powerful he is. And it was him, not Furio, who doesn't even last halfway through Lost Galaxy, who took the initiative and struck Alex down, thus putting the entire story into motion. The way they set up Rancic in direct opposition to the Time Force team was really smart, because it was vicious and personal. Within 5 minutes of seeing him, you know that Rancic is a big deal and not to be taken lightly, and that's before his backstory kicks in. However, the opening episode did push Lucas, Trip, and Katie into the background a bit, and that's a little unfortunate. But I also think the choice to emphasize why stopping Rancic matters beyond the fact that he's evil was the correct call and more than makes up for it. But they get their moments to shine as well, because even though the show is primarily driven by Jen and Wes, it's still carried by a team neither could succeed without. Speaking of Wes, we finally meet him during part 2, and just like with Leo and Kendrix, he meets Jen by bumping into her. Now, I don't bring up these points to criticize Time Force, simply to point out commonalities, because even though there are several similar plot points and moments, Time Force does stand out on its own as a great season, and that lies in how it does things differently. So with the knowledge the others have about the Morphers not being able to activate without genetics similar to Alex's, Jen seeks out Wes at his mansion. He is obviously very skeptical of her claims at first, but eventually joins the others. The Cyclobots re-emerge, and the now almost fully assembled team beats them down. But then, Jen takes back Wes's Morpher because he pretty much filled his genetic role. You could argue that she's being a bit harsh, but really, she's kind of not. The current Wes actually isn't taking this seriously, nor does he completely get why the others are, nor does he come with any of the training that the others possess, and that's on top of the fact that they barely know him, so it makes total sense why Jen would be reluctant to trust him, especially since he reminds her way too much of her allegedly deceased fiancé. That's kind of a rough position to be in, especially since that life-shattering event only happened yesterday from her point of view. This is one of many reasons that Time Force as a season works so well. Most other seasons would have their 5-man team ready to go by episode 2 at the latest, but interestingly enough, in a season about time travel, the season takes its time, knowing that every problem, be them emotional or otherwise, can't be solved in 22-minute increments. They take their time to introduce mutants of the week, they take their time to find the team a place to live and support themselves financially, and they take their time to accommodate themselves to a new Red Ranger after their last one died on the line of duty. And it's only during episode 3 where Wes truly begins his character arc, now finally understanding the gravity of Jen's words and agreeing to take this seriously. He knows that as a rich kid, he's never had to really fight for much, if anything, but given the stuff he's seen over these last 2 days, he realizes now that there is a reason to fight. which then feeds into his relationship with his father and later Eric, that we'll get to later. In reality, Time Force has more of a 3-part opener, which is one of several things that sets it apart from other seasons. There's a lot to unpackage before the team even ends up in the year 2001, but it's not wasting its time, it's using it to build the narrative and to give context to the multiple character arcs on display here. But then, in a move that seems almost contrary to that mentality, Episode 4 gives us the Rancic backstory, which would have come much later in most seasons, or not at all. What I like about this move is that Time Force knows how things will eventually end, at least presumably, since they didn't film every episode all at once. But I'd like to think that the minds behind this show at least had a working understanding of how Rancic would be used as a character, how crucial his personal narrative would be, and how he'd resolve in the end. He's the kind of character that often takes charge of the situation when he feels that he has to, as real leaders do, and that's in spite of his condition that constantly eats away at him without his serum. So, what was your excuse again, Xantrid? And what other season would feature a Ranger's father confronting the main bad and have that be one of the best moments? But the point is that Rancic's involvement as a central antagonist, as directly opposed to other lesser villains, is actually important here. So much so that Time Force made a point to give us a very early backstory, something previous seasons just didn't do. Power Rangers at its best is all about characters, and Time Force is a better season because of who Rancic is as a character, but more on him later. Now that we've covered the first 4 episodes, all of which intertwine and connect in some pretty meaningful ways, let's really dig into the themes that define this season and see how the characters embrace those themes. It's a little different here than when we talked about the Lost Galaxy themes, because that team was a bit more balanced and everyone's focus episodes were significant in their own ways. However, Wes, Jen, and later Eric carry the most important theme of the show on the hero side, which is right in the video's title. Time Force worked in their stories and backstories and how all 3 of them came to terms with them in a great way. But while Wes got the chance to stand up to his father and then eventually make him proud, Lucas got to drive around a little kid. Yeah, them's the breaks. So because of that, in addition to his lax persona, Lucas ends up being the least memorable and least important Ranger on the team. He's not really a bad Ranger per se, although many times his priorities seem questionable, but just like with a lot of the Samurai bunch, he's by no means a special Ranger. Even his confrontation with his old racing rival didn't really develop his character all that much, so honestly, he doesn't really represent any major theme. He's just there. That said, however, Lucas will always have a special place in my heart, specifically because of his Nadira date episode and how it got the best out of him and showed a hilarious daddy side to Rancic. But all in all, a lot more could have been incorporated into Lucas that just, for whatever reason, wasn't. Next, we have Katie, who best represents the cost of fighting for the future. Even being the physically strongest member of the team, she still gets a great focus episode where she's at the heart of the ultimate question. Will fighting ultimately matter in the end? It's something you can only really do with a time travel focused story, so Time Force was smart to give Katie that task. Otherwise, she wouldn't have really developed too much at all. Not that every Ranger absolutely needs to heavily develop to be great. Lily from Jungle Fury doesn't change all that much when you really think about it, but she's still pretty amazing. The only thing with Katie being worried about her future is that if it was at risk of changing, it would have done so already, meaning that their year 3000 is already different from the one this version of 2001 will eventually become. And we know that because in the season finale, Alex informs us that Wes, someone who he cannot be born without, you'll remember, would have died saving the world if the others didn't go back for him, meaning multiverse and parallel dimensions are all on the table here. That's the better choice too, because if their year 3000 was changing because it existed on a singular plane of time, things would get way too needlessly complicated and there would probably be way too many plot holes on top of the plot holes already present. But all that said, it does make some sense that Katie would at least have that fear initially before overcoming it to keep fighting. She proves to be a very emotionally driven character in a way that contrasts Jen's hyper-assertiveness, so it kind of works here, even though she doesn't have a complete grasp on temporal mechanics, but honestly, who really does? And then there's Trip, whose biggest hurdle is overcoming his own sense of self-worth, and then, after clearing that, he helps defend a petty crime mutant who also isn't exceptionally strong relative to his peers. As the little brother of the group, he was always going to be a bit more lighthearted and innocent than the others, but it functions as a solid way for Wes to introduce him to the wonders of the time, which are obviously foreign to him for the most part, and that dynamic is built off Trip sneaking away to try and recruit Wes at a time when Wes was still in flux with his focus. Beyond that, Trip's a really good character, really likable, that has his moments and proves to be a valuable asset to the team, especially since it's his colorful optimism that helps convert Nadira away from what could have been a destiny similar to her father's. Because of that, His arc finds a way to strike a balance between personal and thematic. Because of his kind of ironic passion for humanity, since he is Zybrian, his character connects to the other Time Force theme of embracing humanity, even as an alien, which is why he ended up helping Nadira do the same, even as a mutant, who in turn allowed Rancic to do the same, even as a villain. So even though much about Trip is fairly standard, his overall narrative impact is pretty immense in the grander picture, and that's on top of his mechanical wizardry, and none of that would have really happened if Trip hadn't learned to embrace himself first, despite seeing his teammates as quote-unquote cooler. With the next batch of characters, we really see the changing your destiny theme take hold, a theme that the characters themselves are never too shy about making you aware of. The idea is, of course, a relatively simple one. Anyone who is dedicated enough can reject whatever supposed plan the universe had in mind in order to follow their own path. But what makes it powerful in this season is how it's executed in a multitude of ways, including the idea of time travel itself and how it's used as an avenue for multiple characters to go about accomplishing very personal goals. The next group of characters we'll talk about, including several of the antagonists, all embrace this theme, and we'll start with Eric Meyers. Eric started off with nothing and pulled himself out of his situation through effort, focus, and determination, a combination of his upbringing, the ways and means he fought against it, and the fact that even when he managed to make it to a fancy private school, he was still looked down upon, all combined to create a character that is extremely antisocial, possesses major trust issues, and is consistently looking to push even further. Perfect example, even when he's part of the Silver Guardians, one of his first major actions after formally appearing in the series is to go after both the quantum powers and the role of leader of those same Guardians. When he talked about having bigger plans, he was not bluffing. He desires power and control and never ever wants to be in a position where he's broke and helpless again. These are the kind of traits that could have made him an easy fit for the Evil Ranger eventually turns good archetype, but they go a different route here. Eric is never evil, he's never under anyone's control, and he never gets consumed by quantum powers or anything like that. He just has a more extreme way of dealing with problems because that's who he is. That's who he's always been. And this makes sense, again, because of his history. If you had to work twice as hard just to make it half as far as someone with Colin's kind of money, you might end up pretty resentful too. And I don't really blame him for assuming all people as rich as Wes basically act like his father early on, because as soon as he stepped onto a private school campus, that's what he experienced. So much so that he refuses to reach out to Wes early on, despite Wes genuinely wanting to reach out to him. And an important point to note here is just how long it took him to really change. Alongside everything else, Time Force was patient with him, even if Jen surely wasn't. Even in the final fight, Eric is still adamant about Wes and him not being friends, completely unaware of how they both fought to change their destinies until Wes informs them of it in another great Ranger moment. It literally took the world ending and an emotional challenge from Wes for Eric to finally realize that he wasn't alone in this world. Several key moments brought with it very small and subtle changes to Eric. It was never overplayed as this dramatic revelation that changes him entirely because, in reality, Eric isn't all that wrong about certain things, even though he proves to be a little misled in other areas. Plus, the way he's operated for years now has worked. It got him this job, and it turned him into a Power Ranger, so why would he abruptly change? Instead, it's one step at a time, and sometimes a step backwards, on Eric's journey. The interesting thing here is that Eric already did change his destiny long before Wes re-entered his life. He succeeded. He made it. So his character arc became about realizing that even though he did accomplish a lot, especially given what he had to overcome, that there's value to placing your trust in others. There's value to opening up and working with other people. And when you do, you just might find that those same people, namely Wes, are trying to change their own destinies as you once did. So you're a lot more alike than you might think.
No. We may have grown up differently, but we have a lot in common. We both fought to change our destinies, and we both succeeded.
And after they both change their destinies, guess what? They become partners, friends, equals. Which is as good a transition as any to Wesley Collins himself. But since the script for this video is somehow even longer than the one I wrote for Lost Galaxy, we'll discuss him, Jen, and everything else in part 2. Turns out there was a lot more to discuss than I had originally thought. But until then, thanks for watching.